So as you know, I am here to talk about some of the experiences in my life that led me to write my two novels, Livy Owen Lived Here and Body of Water, and I'm especially going to talk about this book, Body of Water. This is a book that deals with poverty and a pagan faith in the life of a West Virginia kid. Now, sometimes when I was a West Virginia kid, I felt like if people knew certain things about me up front, that they would, that I would have an easier time fitting into the world. I felt like there wouldn't be so many questions from people, so many awkward pauses when I spoke to them. There would still be times when I didn't know exactly what I was supposed to say or what I was supposed to do in a given situation, but I felt like those instances would be forgiven because people would know the reasons behind any deficits that I happened to exhibit. I thought a few times about having a t-shirt made, some type of disclaimer. Warning, do not expect the wearer of this t-shirt to behave in a typical socially appropriate manner. She's not rude, she just didn't learn the same stuff you did. I guess the major things you need to know about me to understand me are these. I haven't always had a lot of money. I've been technically, but not terribly, homeless. I'm somewhat paganish by faith, and when I was younger, my family had a porta potty and it got repossessed. I think that last bit really does what those other statements don't. It serves to illustrate, in a nutshell, the realities of my childhood, that it has been mildly comical, but largely impractical. Once there was a time when I was a kid standing on a mountain, watching a pickup truck disappear down a long, twisting dirt road with a big green porta potty rocking and bobbing in the back until it went out of sight. Then I went around behind the house and I peed on the ground. When you fast forward and you find me graduating Marshall University with a teaching degree and stepping in front of my first classroom as an education professional, you don't see the girl who once had a porta potty confiscated for lack of funds. But she's there. She's everywhere I go. Both as a child in school and then later as a teacher, I've gotten the opportunity to observe firsthand how certain factors affect the schooling experience. Income, living situation, resources, religion. All of these things shape and are shaped by the ways in which we gain education. As a writer, I've gotten to delve even more deeply into these factors, exploring them from new as well as familiar angles. The verdict I've reached is this. To fit into the world, nobody should have to wear a disclaimer on their shirt announcing their porta potty repo status. It should be easier than that. I mentioned the concept of fitting in, and I'll mention it several times as the evening goes on. When I say fitting in, it's important for me to make the distinction. I'm not talking about fitting in the sense of having the coolest clothes or the newest shoes or the sparkly pencils that the other kids are collecting. I'm talking about, I mean, sure, as kids you do worry about those things, but I'm talking about fitting in ways that make you successful in operating within a public school system or any education system. Being able to raise your hand in class, knowing how to gain teacher attention if you have a problem, having a number 2 pencil and a 3-ring binder and colored pencils, arriving at school on time and relatively well rested for your end of school assessments. All the little things that you have to do, all the little boxes that you have to be able to check to be able to advance to the next level in your schooling. When I say fitting in, those are the things that I'm talking about. There were a few factors when I was young that set me apart from my classmates and made it hard for me to fit in. There was income, of course, and there were family values that seemed to differ wildly from the families of my peers, and at times there was religion. I grew up attending Christian church, or more accurately, I grew up hiding out in church basements, sneaking cheese crackers or even communion bread if there wasn't much to eat at home, while my father was upstairs preaching. This was somewhere after coal mining, but before substitute teaching in his careers, in an economy that made it difficult to maintain one job for any length of time in our town. He traveled from church to church, delivering his message, and we trailed him from church to church, never doubting that this would be our lives. Church functions and Sundays in long dresses. I had some wonderful experience in those environments, singing songs with good friends. I was happy there. So how did I get from the church basement in my long dress to standing on a hillside, wearing a pentacle necklace and watching the plumbing drive away? In both of my novels, I boil down big changes like that for the family's reason for leaving behind their old life and entering the conflict that moves the story. I always boiled that down in my writing to one specific thing. That seemed easier to me in my writing. One specific moment, a dramatic moment, in both cases a fire, and that was accidental. Although a chimney fire did play a role in the loss of our farm when I was 3, overall, each home we lost was in the small moments. the moment when we chose food over paying rent, the moment when we put gas in the car instead of paying the utilities, the moment the locks got changed or we slipped out the back door as the landlord was taping the eviction notice to the front. So onward we would go to the next rental, the next place for which we had high hopes. And really, our high hopes usually panned out, mostly because we were kids and our parents were masters at keeping all the scary stuff away from us. We knew about money, as most people who don't have money know about it. And we knew that we didn't have it, but we were raised to approach our troubles as if they were conflicts in a gripping novel, a really good novel about 3 adorable and excellent children who would no doubt sooner or later arrive at a happy ending. We were mostly fine. Even through losing the farm, the chimney fire not a month after the insurance lapsed, the neighbors' dogs killing the goats, and the neighbors themselves breaking in to steal what they could. Even through all of the days and nights we stayed at the local Christian bookstore whose owners forbade us to read basically anything that didn't come from the store shelves. Even the night we came back to the home of a family friend where we'd been staying, and my brain said, "Is she having a garage sale?" Even when my stomach already knew that that was our stuff she had just sat out on the curb without knowing whether we had any place to go. Through all of that, as long as we were with our family, we were fine. It was all just plot, and we'd write our way through it and figure out a happy ending. That was not so at school. Our biggest troubles came there. School was where we did not fit in, where students asked uncomfortable questions in the name of being caring friends, where teachers made incorrect assumptions and acted on them. The condition of being poor is incompatible a lot of times with the act of attending public school. You're supposed to arrive at school clean and well-rested, dressed in something that fits and is in good repair. You're supposed to bring notebooks and loose-leaf paper, Elmer's glue sticks, and sharpened colored pencils. As a teacher, it's easy to assume that a kid has access to what they need for school. If they don't, too often, it's easy for people to blame the child's family or assume that even the child doesn't care, especially as a child becomes a teenager and is responsible for more of those supplies and actions themselves. Too often, people equate lack of preparedness as a lack of interest or lack of motivation, and that simply isn't true in a lot of cases. No matter how motivated you are, if you have to walk a few miles to get to the store that sells your school supplies, if you have to spend half your grocery budget on them, if you have to walk to school or you have to come to school in the same clothes you wore yesterday because you don't have a way to wash them, you've used up more motivation than a classmate may have had in the first place to get there in their clean clothes with their nice supplies. In addition to that, you're sweaty from the walk, and you're tired, and you're hungry, and your clothes are filthy, and you don't have the energy now to care whether you've got the right supplies and whether you're using them correctly. Everything tends to be more exhausting without money. The other troubling thing that kept happening in school was that when I would start a new school, often teachers would assume that I was academically behind the other kids, simply based on my income and my appearance. Or they would recognize that I was just fine academically, and they would treat me as though this were some huge accomplishment, that I had succeeded in spite of my family, that I had overcome my upbringing. One of my earliest memories is of my mother tolerantly helping me drag home half the horse books in the library, and we're talking Encyclopedia of Equus, not kids' horse books, and patiently helping me untangle vocabulary like thoroughbred and equitation, all these horse words that I was pining to know. Not easy words for a 6-year-old, and not easy words for her mother to coach her through. We read books like we breathed. Mom read to us every day, and we grew up reading to each other. It was a part of everything. It was essential. That's how we were raised, and that's why we did fine in school, even when we did our homework by the light of a campfire or at a stranger's kitchen table. Later on, I remember my dad, bone-tired from work, making time in his evening to go over and over and over my times tables, helping me drag my pitiful math grade up from a D to an A. I did nothing in spite of my family. There are a lot of different kinds of homeless, and I have been lucky. I have never lived on the street. I was lucky that my circumstances never got that bad. The closest we ever came was when I was 10, and we had to move out because the trailer sold. We piled into the truck with no idea where we were going, and we made plans to sleep in a local park. There was an outdoor amphitheater with an indoor dressing room, and it didn't have a door, so it couldn't be locked, so we could easily access it. We knew the park hours and also the park officials. We were pretty sure we could pull this off. To this day, that feeling, that freedom of leaving one house and not knowing where we would be going that night or where the next house would be, that's the feeling I tap into when I write, when I need a character to run off and do something wild that's going to turn out all right, and they know it. The memory is giddiness and joy, not dismay, not even fear, not anything you would assume. Maybe fortunately, although I was certainly disappointed as a 10-year-old, my cousin Jack stepped in and offered us a room. We slept indoors that night. There were other times we stayed with family friends, at the bookstore, with my grandmother in her cabin, with the metal bowl of ice-cold well water outside on a rock, the only means of washing up before school. And we certainly stayed in some unconventional situations. Motels a time or two. We took our van to North Carolina expecting to stay, and came home a week later when things didn't pan out. We lived in a converted post office with mail slots in between mine and my sister's rooms, which was awesome because the walls in that apartment did not go all the way to the ceiling. So if we talked at night, our parents could hear us, but they couldn't hear us slipping notes in the mail slot between our rooms. Our other sister had the luxury of having the only walls in the entire apartment that went all the way to the ceiling. That's because she slept in the hall closet. Now, it was a large enough closet for her to squeeze into, but it was a closet. And my other sister and I were jealous. Hey, no fair, you get the walls, you get to live in the closet. So that's sisters for you. We were very normal siblings. As long as we weren't in school, we were fine. But kind and well-meaning and altruistic teachers over the years made assumptions. They tried to help. Again and again, they picked up on the fact that something was off. And they tried to save us, to rescue us from the circumstances of our wonderful family, from whom we did not need rescuing. As a teacher, you do run into these situations, and they're very hard to read from the other perspective. There's never this one big, dramatic moment where a child in your class is going to be able to articulate what's happening in their life. It's never, hey, Miss Dooley, my family is struggling, and I wasn't able to do the homework. I wasn't able to clean up for school. I wasn't able to get here on time because our car doesn't work. We don't have money for laundry. The electric was cut off and I couldn't see the paper. It's going to be 1,000 little moments that if you blink, you'll miss, and the child is never going to bring them up again. They tried to tell you and you couldn't hear them. But when you do hear them, that's when you experience real terror. What are you supposed to do about this problem? Here you're 22. You're just out of college. You've just mailed the first payment on your next 30 years of student loan debt. Your car was manufactured the same year as most of your middle schoolers. And here's this kid who seems off somehow, who seems to have this problem, and you don't know what to do about it. And although this was covered in your class, and I know your wonderful professors, and I took classes here, and I know that they did talk about the fact that you're going to run into these problems, the difference between sitting in the basement of Jenkins Hall trying to participate in a discussion about poverty in the classroom while listening to the uniquely vocal plumbing in that building talking in the walls behind you, and actually being the grown-up in charge of fixing this problem for a real child in front of you, well, to you, that suddenly becomes the difference between reading a book on baseball in the safety of the library and stepping up to the plate. But you're a teacher. So what you do is you grip your bat and you step up to the plate, and you're pretty sure that it's a fruit bat and a dinner plate because you are not outfitted for this job at all. But you're a teacher. You make do. You do what needs done. You ask the child what you can do to help, or you nudge her in the right direction toward a high-paying job that will get her out of this familial cycle of poverty, or you provide her with just the right thing, the thing she needs, the shoes, the coat, the notebook, and you watch her walls come up, and you're baffled. You watch the way her cheeks color with shame, or maybe it's anger, and she very carefully smiles, and she walks away, and she never approaches you again. The kid wasn't asking you to fix her. She was asking you to fix the details of your class that excluded her. But you get that too late. You get that years too late. And what you're left with is all these faces in your head of kids whose heart you broke, implying, sometimes accidentally letting slip, that the day-to-day facts of their lives are subpar, that there's something wrong with them, with their family. When they're at home with their family, they might be fine. It's only with you that they don't fit in. In my novel, Body of Water, the main character, Ember, lives in a campground for most of the book. That setting was begging to be written because I myself started 7th grade from a campground. We lived there for 11 weeks. And I always knew, I write novels and I lived in a campground. I should probably put those two things together. That's pretty interesting. But for years I couldn't write the book. And I finally figured out why. It's because novels have to have conflict. And looking back, on my 12-year-old self, for me, there was no conflict in that campground. There was only adventure. We had never been on vacation, and this was vacation for a whole summer with no deadline, no end to it in sight. I woke most days in the campground to the lingering smell of last night's campfire and the first slant of sun coming through the little mesh window in the roof of my tent. The first thing I did most days was go jump in the lake. Not the way my sisters told me, but actually go jump in the lake. The water was still cold, and it was clear because the sand and mud at the bottom wasn't yet churned up by anybody else's feet. I was the first person there, which was really cool because we had never gotten to the beach that early before. Sometimes it was just me, and at 12, this was the most independent I had been. The campground was its own little world, enclosed. It felt safe, so I was allowed to wander. Other times, my sisters would join me in the water. We would float out near the buoys, looking at the reflections on clouds on the water, and talking quietly about everything from breakfast to where would we live when we grew up. When I think of our childhood conversations, that was the overriding theme a lot of the times. Where would we live? What would our home look like? Where would we settle? But although those conversations could at times be wistful, they were never tragic, the way some people seem to expect. They were never the conversation of lost children looking for something better. They were the words of kids who felt like they had seen so many wonderful, unique places that they couldn't possibly settle on a single one to spend the rest of their lives in. After our float, we'd swim lazily back to shore, eat an apple Danish for breakfast, and wander the campground, meeting new people every day, as one wave of campers would fade out and another would fade in. Early summer, there were local families, eager to get the jump on family reunions and overnight birthday parties. By midsummer, vacations were in full swing, and campers from other areas slept and fished and swam around the edges of our home. By August, vacations dwindling as the pencil stickers on the floor of the Walmart started pointing the way to back-to-school savings. There were fewer and fewer children coming to the campground. They were gearing up for sports. They were gearing up for school. They were getting the last few moments in with their families, and kids at the campground were replaced by kayakers and whitewater rafters waiting on the spillways opening. It was really interesting to stay there and watch these populations change and meet all these different types of people. Every Friday, mid-afternoon, we welcomed new faces to the campground, and every Sunday evening, we watched them go, and we looped around the campground in their absence, calling each twist of road by the street name that we'd made up for it, picking up abandoned firewood and toting it back to our campsite to make our evening fire to cook dinner. It was really the coolest thing. And then school started. I was starting 7th grade, and back then, that was the first year of junior high. We didn't have middle school, so this was the first year that I would be out of elementary school. The first day was a shock. Suddenly, I was in a school with changing classes and slamming lockers and lots of children who did not live in campgrounds. Suddenly, it mattered that I had skinned knees and I smelled like campfire smoke. Suddenly, it mattered whether I got to sleep enough at night, whether I had a place to do my homework. The campground we stayed at was nice, extremely nice. It had 2 cinder block shower houses, and each one had a laundry room. We would sit on the washing machines or on the green cement floor, and we would do our homework in that small swath of electricity to which we had access, because it's really hard to do your math homework by the light of a flickering campfire. At night, everything still felt okay. Everything still felt normal. This was still our summer home. There were still marshmallows on sticks, although, to be honest, we were getting sick of them by then. But the cover stories got harder. Once school's in, you can't say your family's on vacation. In the middle of July, early August, that sounds normal. Hey, why are you staying at the campground? Oh, we're on vacation. But once school's in, you can't say, oh, we're on vacation on a Tuesday with school in September. So it's no longer believable. I remember mumbling something about fumigation. I didn't know what that was, but I did know that in books, people said they had to move out of their house for a little while for it to be done. I mumbled excuses about painting. They were weak excuses, but no one ever called me on them. Who would think to? And I was glad. But school mornings were hard, especially when the drunken late summer campers insisted on blasting their music from inside their tent at the very next campsite till 2 in the morning. I'm sure they were just as surprised as I was one night when I popped my sleepy head out of my tent and screeched in their direction, "Don't you people know it's a school night?" So we would wake up in the morning, And there would be no more early morning swims and philosophical conversations about where we would settle. There would be no more lazy breakfasts before being turned loose to wander and make new friends. Now we would duck falling leaves and get our school clothes on, damp as they were, because by this point in the summer our tents were wearing through. Mine had a hole in the side from the roller skates, and my poor sister, hers had a hole from the crutch where she injured her foot on her bike. We would pile into the truck, and Dad would drive us into town for school, me and Heather to the junior high and Jennifer to the high school. It felt like everything was changing, and I didn't want it to, but how long can you live in a campground? That was where the seeds of Body of Water were sown, in that unsettling feeling of your family vacation outlasting your summer vacation, and there being nothing you could do to change it. And that realization that as happy as you might be with your family and as much as you fit in with them, at school, no matter what you do, you're just not going to fit in. As an adult, that same sentiment came back to me again. There was this child in one of the classrooms that I taught very early on in my career. This child was a sweetheart, wide grin, earnest face, rotten as an old tomato. And this kid needed a coat. He did not have a good coat. He came to school in this worn old hoodie, even in the middle of winter. And I have no problem with a cold kid getting a coat. What I had a problem with was a well-meaning staff member walking into my classroom in the middle of class and presenting that child with a brand new coat still in its Kmart bag in front of everyone. He smiled like always, and he took the coat, and he very carefully didn't look at that staff member or at any other staff member or the other kids or at me. He put on the coat, and when it was time for the buses, he went home, smiled at me through the window, and I never saw that coat again. When I see that child's face in my head, and I still do, that wide, betrayed smile, he thought I got it, and I didn't, not at the time. It takes me back, and I remember, too, being that kid. I remember this day in 4th or 5th grade, one of the several schools that I ended up at that year, when the teacher sent me out of the room to run an errand. Everybody had been picking on me earlier. I had been having a horrible day, but now my day was turning around, because now I got to run an errand for the teacher. And I loved running errands. I liked to wander the hallways. I liked to look in all the other classrooms and see what everybody else was doing and was it cooler than what we were doing. I liked to peek up into the upper grades and see what my sisters were up to so that I could tell Mom on them later for not doing their homework. And I liked to be able to get out of the classroom for a little while and be on my own. So I was feeling good. When I got back to class, everyone was behaving just a little bit differently. And nobody was looking at me, except the few kids who were. A few weeks later, another kid got sent out of that room to run an errand. And in his absence, the teacher pinned us with her best death glare. And those of you who are going to be teachers, do you have a death glare? If you don't, you need to start working on it now, because you will need it no matter whether you think you will or not. She had a great death glare. That woman, you would do whatever she told you to do. But she pinned us with that glare, and she told us we had just better not keep picking on that kid, that he couldn't help it, he was poor and looked a little different. His family was struggling, and we weren't going to pick on him anymore. I sat there mortified, too embarrassed to even be angry, trying not to cry, with the realization that she must have made the same speech about me not 2 weeks prior. The burden of fitting in should not be on a kid. It should be on us grown-ups to teach kids how to fit together, to model that you can fit together, even though everybody's different and from a different family and from a different background. To not judge a kid, to not single out a kid, to not exclude someone from the inner circle of our class because of looks or circumstances or any other factor. That teacher meant well, and I love her for it, because she couldn't stand by watching this kid get tormented, and she didn't know what to do, and I get that. But what we end up with is this idea that we can teach kids to tolerate each other, to avoid teasing or bullying because they know there are issues in that kid's life at play. We slap a disclaimer on that kid. Warning, do not pick on this kid. He can't help it. He's poor. And that's not an understanding that I want to foster in my classroom. That idea that we need to model acceptance and understanding among our kids, it isn't always easy. I taught early on in my career in this small classroom in a town that I was new to. I had just moved to this small town. I had just moved to this small school community. And I had these wonderful staff members who worked in my classroom, and they'd been there forever. They'd been there, for 5 years. And I teach special education, and at the high school level, you have kids for 4 or 5 or 6 years. They don't leave your classroom until they graduate. So in a lot of settings. So she had the same kids year after year after year, and she knew them, and she knew their families, and they all knew her, and everybody had a very good routine down. And I was this new person, brand new teacher, walking into this environment, and I was very reserved about making changes to their routines because I was new at this. So when this assistant said, it's okay, everybody is in here, everybody in this room is Christian, and we always have a Christmas tree, and everybody loves it, and the kids look forward to it, I didn't say anything. Even though I was uncomfortable having that Christmas tree up in the room because I didn't feel like that was the right thing to do, to endorse a specific religion in my classroom, I was uncomfortable, and I never said a word. I didn't want to do a disservice to the kids by taking away a custom that they knew and were comfortable with. I felt like an outsider, and I didn't want to change things for them. Then, long about Easter, this young girl walked into my class, a peer tutor, wearing her pentacle necklace. And I looked at the Easter decorations that the staff members were starting to put up on the windows, and I put my foot down. I said, we can't have Easter decorations up. It just doesn't feel right. This is a public school classroom, and we don't know anybody's religious background, and it just doesn't feel right. It was an uncomfortable conversation, and I had avoided it for a long time. You know what I did wrong there? A few things. For one thing, I didn't follow my gut in structuring my classroom. For another, it took a 17-year-old being brave enough to display a non-mainstream faith for me to be brave enough to create an environment that did not endorse any religion or exclude anyone of any faith. And third, and possibly the worst in my mind, I taught my students, all of my students, I modeled for my students that as long as you are in your small classroom, in your small town, and you don't know that anybody is different, it's okay to assume that we're all the same. I did that, even though I grew up, sometimes homeless, and slowly evolving toward a pagan faith in my own small hometown school. I should have known better. Our experiences shape our view of the world, so it stands to reason that my religious faith and my experiences with poverty go hand in hand. It also stands to reason that those worldviews follow us into adulthood. We expect that we're going to wake up one day, 18 or 22, or getting our high school diploma, getting our college diploma, finishing student teaching, or getting our first teaching assignment. We expect to wake up suddenly capable of checking all the boxes that we didn't know to check as a kid. Suddenly able to meet all of the deadlines and behave in the ways that all the other people our age seem to naturally get. I certainly thought that. I thought that I would get to college, and I didn't necessarily expect to be taught to do the things that I didn't know how to do. I just thought I would pick them up naturally. It seemed like everyone else had. Everyone else knew what they were supposed to do. Everyone else knew how to advance to the next level to gain that success that we were all looking for. Growing up, I didn't observe a lot of the things that I needed to know as a grown-up. I didn't observe balancing checkbooks. I didn't observe paying a mortgage. I didn't know what that was. I remember fairly recently figuring out what people meant when they talked about making a house payment. I didn't understand. I thought, you own your house, why are you paying on it? You don't have a landlord, you don't pay rent. I don't get that. I had never heard of that. I didn't understand about getting a bank loan for a car. I didn't arrive at adulthood suddenly knowing how to fit in. Like I said, my sister and I came to college together. We came to Marshall, and we got here and found out that our financial aid had been canceled. It was just a glitch, but at the time we were told that it was canceled, and that if we didn't take care of it in the next couple of hours, literally 2 hours, we were going to have to go back home. Our dorm room was going to be canceled, our classes were going to be dropped. So we hoofed it over to Smith Hall, and we spent a lot of time in that financial aid office getting things sorted out, and a wonderful person, I wish I knew her name because I would still be sending her Christmas cards and holiday cards to this day. This wonderful person fixed that problem, and she made sure that we got to stay at Marshall. To this day, every time we walk out of Smith Hall, my sister and I call that the good vibes spot, because that's the place where we felt this relief, and that feeling comes back every time we walk through, right up there at the top of behind the Old Main, between the Old Main and Smith Hall. That's where we felt okay because everything was fixed. But that not fitting in, even as an adult, was never more clear than the night before I began student teaching. Is anybody here student teaching right now? Oh, wow, lots of you. You guys must be tired. Is anybody like getting really close to student teaching? Yeah, some of you. Well, I thought I would get to student teaching and I would know, I would know what I was doing. I would be very capable of feeling professional and everything would be okay. I had my clothes laid out for my first day of student teaching. I had my plans in place. I was going to go to bed early, get up and eat a good breakfast, get dressed, and go to my student teaching experience. 3 guesses how well that worked out. I lived in this trailer that I rented. It was out in West Pea Ridge Way. And my partner and I, our car had broken down very recently. So we were taking the bus out, getting off the bus and walking out our road about a mile to the trailer. So we got off the bus, we walked out there after our evening endeavors that day, and it was January, so it was early, but it was already dark. I went to flip the light on in that trailer, and nothing happened. And I thought, shoot. I know there's a learning curve, but I do at least know that I have to pay the electricity bill. I do know that I paid it. What happened? And so I called the power company to make sure there hadn't been a check lost in the mail or something. And they said, no, your account's fine. You're actually a little past due, but we're not going to disconnect you yet. You're fine. Ooh. And that's pretty much the sound that my head made when I tried to flip the light switch and nothing happened. So the sound of my well-laid plans falling apart. So it turned out, I called the landlord, and it turned out the electricity in the trailer, the wiring had gone bad. And it was not an easy fix, nor was it a cheap fix. And it was not going to happen that night before student teaching started the next day. So, so we walked back out to Walmart, and so that we could use the phone up there to call my partner's sister to come and pick us up and take us to her dorm room. So, okay, we can sleep in the dorm room for the night. I've got my outfit with me. I'll take it with me. It's okay. I'll be, having to wear shower shoes again. Haven't had to do that in a few years, but at the very least, I'll be clean and somewhat rested and ready for student teaching to start. But by the time we've stood there for 2 hours waiting for her sister to get out of class, I'm in a panic. I'm not going to get to sleep before I start student teaching. I'm standing at Walmart. I'm tired. I'm hungry. Everything's falling apart, and I'm panicking. And my partner is standing there going, breathe. It's okay. You're going to get through this. You're fine. And then she goes inside to get me a cup of water to help me calm down. And while she's gone, this woman approaches me, very sweet-looking woman, walks up to me and she says, honey, I have no problem with you guys, but if you could not show affection with your same-sex partner in public, I would really appreciate it because I have a kid and I don't want to have to answer her questions. And I basically stood there like this, okay, for the rest of the night, waiting to get picked up and get out of there and hoping that this nightmare of a night would someday end. So I eventually made it to the dorms. I slept over in Buskirk and ended up getting to student teaching on time, just a couple hours sleep, a little more rumpled than I wanted, a little bit cranky, but I got there and I thought, okay, I'm going to turn this experience around. I'm going to step in front of this classroom. It's all going to be okay. So I step into that school, and there's this kid who looks vaguely familiar staring at me with this look and shaking her head. And I said, hi. And she said, I seen you at Walmart. And I thought, wow, I am never going to fit into any school ever, even as a grown-up. Fitting in isn't something that kids just do to be comfortable. You have to be able to fit in to survive. You have to be able to meet deadlines to advance. There are 1,000 little instances where not fitting in will make you more hungry, or more tired, or more lonely, or more vulnerable. But what we need to teach kids is skills, not to bemoan their deficits and their upbringing and make them feel like there's something wrong with their lives, and certainly not to alienate them, to make them feel as though the message we teach is meant for everyone else, all the normal kids, and not them. We're in that room to teach everyone, every child. We're in this world to teach everyone and to learn from them. And we all, regardless of religion, income, sexual orientation, regardless of the 1,000 little ways that we differ, we all have something to teach and something to learn. And that's what I want to leave with my kids. Thank you very much.
has graciously allowed time for you to ask questions, and she has touched on a number of different themes, all having to do with inclusion and diversity and personal life experience. And she and I would like you to feel free to ask her questions. I was at her presentation last night, and fabulous. She will answer all your questions.
I have a question that has nothing to do with teaching.
Okay.
I'm just curious how you went from following your father around preaching to moving toward a paganistic religion. Like, is that how you explained it?
Yeah, to a sort of a pagan faith. And there's a lot of different types. It's a good question. It's how did I go from being the kid in the long church dress to moving toward a pagan faith? And that was I like any finding of a spiritual path. That was a long process that's still going on. There's a lot of different types of pagan religions, which is why I use that umbrella term. There are a lot of specifics, just like with any religion, and a lot of specific paths and a lot of specific names. For my family and for me, that journey involved going through the experiences that we did and realizing that the needs that we had, the mental and spiritual needs that we had weren't being met by our current religion. What we needed was something where we felt empowered to do what we needed to do in our lives. And of course, that can be found in any religion, but for us, this was the one that connected. It's a very nature-based, in most ways, it's a very nature-based religion, and we grew up a lot of the times outside. We grew up a lot of times, connecting with nature, living off nature, picking blackberries one summer, to survive. And that taking from nature and trying to give back to it is a very pagan thing. And so that's one way that moved us toward that religion. So that's a really good question. Thank you.
Did you ever get a chance?
No, you're fine.
Did you ever get a chance to maybe not explain it, but to make it a valid religion in the classrooms that you said, and that's a typical view, especially in our society in West Virginia, that everybody's Christian. We can put up a Christian figure. Everybody's
right.
We can do that. Did you ever get a chance to maybe talk to somebody about that at school level?
I never specifically, as a teacher or as a student, I never specifically addressed paganism. I only addressed the idea that not everybody was Christian. And as adults, my sisters and I, we all had roughly the same upbringing, and we've ended up one Christian, one I think would probably describe herself as atheist, and me being, as I say, paganish. So even though we led very similar and parallel lives, we ended up in different places. And so I never specifically addressed, here's paganism and it's valid. I just addressed, we can't look at a group of people, however small, and assume that we know their faith. But I think the fact that I did never address it specifically was the reason that I did give that religion to Ember in my book. I wanted a chance to specifically address it, because when you're a teacher and you have kids coming to you with questions, it's very hard to find resources that deal with paganism in a balanced way. It's very difficult to find a character who's pagan. It's very difficult to find paganism treated as a matter-of-fact religion like any other religion and any other type of teen literature. So though I didn't address it in the classroom, I did decide to address it in my book. And my character's a little braver and a little bit louder than me, so she does address it in the book. Who else has questions? Yes?
I don't really have a question, but I just thought that you made a really good point about, you said something about not trying to fix the child and their situation, but to fix your classroom.
Right.
And I thought that was a really good point, because I think a lot of people think that they have to go and try to fix these people's families, but they may be, that's all they know, and that may be okay.
Right.
And I think that's, because I, come to that, and I just want to fix their whole life.
Right.
You need to focus on your classroom. So I thought that was a really good point.
Right. Well, thank you. I know it's something that I came around to slowly that makes a lot of sense to me, that you don't, even though that child's life might not make sense to you and it feels giving and it feels kind to try to fix it, they don't always need fixed. It might just be a different type of culture, a different type of life.
Right.
I saw another hand over there. Yeah.
How did you bring that into your classroom? Like, instead of focusing on fixing the child in the home life there, did you incorporate the things that they need, make sure that they had those to either take home or have in the classroom? And did you just create like an open, positive atmosphere? Is that kind of what you?
Yeah, to the extent that I could, I would make resources available for everybody and not specifically say, here's this for a kid who needs it, or here's this for you because I suspect you don't have it. I would try to make resources that I knew were lacking available to everybody, to avail themselves of if they needed to. I know that when I was a kid, if somebody tried to share resources with me specifically, I was afraid to take them because I was afraid that was confirming, yes, we're living in poverty, and yes, maybe social services might want to peek over here because we're living in a campground, and I didn't want to acknowledge. As I got older, I didn't want to acknowledge that there might be a problem, but when I was younger, there wasn't a problem for me. I had a wonderful childhood, and I was happy, and I had amazing parents, and so I didn't want to accept something that might hurt my parents' feelings and make them feel like they weren't providing something. So I know as a kid, I wouldn't have wanted to take something that was specifically given to me. So as a teacher, I try to, if there's something I know is needed, I'll make it available, but not ever single out a child. Yeah. That is an excellent question. How do you balance the need to stand up for children and for diversity without, when you still need to fit in and find a job and find career success? That's a great question, and the only advice that I can give to that is what I tried to do at every turn, and sometimes was successful and oftentimes wasn't, was at each turn evaluate the situation and decide what could be done. As teachers, I think a lot of us, although we are concerned with keeping our career on the right track and we are concerned with moving forward in that career, I don't know that any of us would ever do something we felt was not beneficial to a child. So I think in most of those instances, we do what feels right, even if it's scary, even if it makes us feel like we're not going to be successful at finding a job, we're not going to be successful at keeping a job. And luckily, in my experiences, I've never found that it held me back. I've found school administrators and fellow staff are wonderful people who want me to do what I see is right for my kids, even if they don't necessarily understand or agree with my perspective. So I've never found it to be in conflict, although I think most of us would agree that if that conflict does arise, we err on the side of doing what's right for our kids. Who else has a question? I know a lot of you are student teaching and you're tired, but come on, you have questions. Yeah.
You said there's various forms of paganism. I don't know much about it. May I ask, what's the difference between your denomination as compared to others?
That's a good question. What's the difference between my, I guess you'd say, denomination of paganism and others? And really, that's a very broad. The answer to that would be very broad, because practitioners of pagan religions oftentimes tend, and I'm not trying to speak in an umbrella way for everybody, but oftentimes seem to practice a very private path of paganism. Even when you look at my two parents who are pagan, they don't practice the same type of faith. My mother does astrology and divination, and my father does these amazing musical type of spiritual connections with drums and guitars, and it's a very different path for each of them. It's a different path for me, and I suspect that will change for me as I get older. So it's not so much how do we differ from other groups, so much as how do we personally, serve what works for us and find what works for us. Other questions? I'm going to drink water while you think of them, if I find my water. Anybody else?
Mm-hmm. Really will answer anything.
Yes.
How exactly do you decide when to actually step in as a teacher where you feel like the child is actually unsafe with the conditions of the living?
Yeah. How do you know when to step in and not?
Where's the line at?
Yeah. And I don't think you can answer where the line is without knowing a specific child or a specific situation. I think the thing to do is certainly never let anything slide that doesn't feel safe to you, and follow your instincts on that. If you don't think a child is safe, or you don't think the child, is being cared for, react to that, respond to that, but always try to respond in a way that is respectful to the child without assuming anything about their family. And I'll tell you a quick story that ties in there. That I don't really have my sister's permission to tell, so I'm going to keep it brief. But one of my sisters has a child who has a special need, and that child, when she was younger, didn't like certain types of fabric and was very resistant to wearing different types of clothing. And so she would wear the same thing basically every day, and teachers kept giving her stuff. They kept giving her clothes. They kept bringing her things by the house, and assuming that my sister wasn't providing for her. And they would say these things to my sister's face. I know that you can't provide this, so I'm providing it. And lots of them even would use words that made my sister very uncomfortable. You know, they were gonna help her. They were gonna make this situation accessible to her. And my sister was already doing those things. There were issues at play that teacher, well-meaning as she may have been, couldn't see. So my advice is absolutely don't ignore something that feels unsafe. Don't assume it's a cultural difference, but never treat that situation, even as you respond to it, as something that is the fault of the family or the fault of the child. So always be respectful, and I'm sure I don't have to tell you that, but always be respectful, you know, to the child and family. And it's easy. The other thing I'll say about that is it's easy to do that in front of the child and then go behind closed doors with staff and talk about, and I've heard this so many times, talk about this is awful, this kid's living in this situation, that parent needs to do this or that parent needs to do that. Please don't have those conversations. As the kid who's been in that school, it doesn't matter how many closed doors are between you and the teacher. You know about those conversations. You hear those things and you pick up on those things. So try to withhold judgment in dealing with those situations. Yes? Yeah. Wow.
I'm going to be working with preschoolers, so this isn't something that I'll necessarily have to deal with. But maybe some people in this group will.
To address how, you know, do you mean like how to react?
Yeah, how to react. If
a kid comes out to you? That's a good question, and I didn't come out until college. So as a kid, I didn't. Although I certainly knew much earlier than that, I didn't ever talk to a teacher. I didn't ever trust a teacher with that. So the question is how to deal with a kid coming out to you as gay or lesbian in your classroom. And my answer is, you know, just like a kid trusting you with anything else, just you know, this kid has approached you because they feel the need to share this aspect of themselves with you. They need to feel like you're not judging them, you're not panicking, and you're not telling them that. I'm trying to articulate this the right way, because like I've been talking about with poverty, a teacher finds out that you're living in poverty and they panic and they think there's something wrong. It's not something that's wrong that you're telling them. There are certainly uncomfortable situations and even dangers that can arise for a kid in a public school who comes out as gay, but you don't want the kid to feel like you're saying, oh, it's going to be okay, everything's horrible. Just be there for the kid, let them take the lead, listen, and be very, you know, very, I'm sorry I'm stuttering so much, but I'm thinking through this as I talk, how I would handle that situation. As if I had come out to a teacher when I was in you know, secondary school, or you know, if I had been in middle school, I would want the teacher to be very matter of fact, very calm, and not make a big deal, because I wouldn't want to feel like this was something that was awful or shocking. Does that make sense? Do you have insight on what you wish had been, how that had been, you wish that had been addressed? Not to put you on the spot, and you don't have to answer, but.
For me, I wish that they would just said, you know, that it was okay.
Yeah.
It was okay, but sometimes they would act that way, and then they would just call the counselor.
Yeah.
The counselor would come and pull me out of class.
Yeah.
I got this impression that there was something wrong with
Right. Yeah, and I could see where the teacher would mean well with that. Well, maybe, you know, if you're coming to me to talk, maybe you need to see the counselor so you have someone to talk to. And I can see where as a kid that would be horrifying. Oh my gosh, I thought I was just trusting you with this fact of my life, and suddenly you're calling the counselor and I have to get pulled out of class and it's a big deal. I could see that being terrifying, and I'm sorry that happened.
it. And it comes up with the betrayal.
Yeah. And that's a really good point. If a kid comes out to you, I certainly wouldn't tell anybody else without that child's permission. That's a very private thing that they've trusted you with, and I would never break that trust by sharing it with anybody else without the child's permission and the child being present. So yeah, just being matter of fact and letting them know, it's okay, and then letting them take the lead on what they need from you, whether it's reassurance or resources or whatever it may be. Thank you for that question. Who else has questions? I will try not to stutter, but I am going to drink water again while you think.
How you were saying when you grew up and your parents, you felt they were providing for you, but your teachers were taking it in the wrong way?
Yeah.
Did anyone try to talk to your parents? Would you recommend them trying to talk to your parents and understanding rather than just coming to the child and saying, hey, you need this?
It would be so easy to alienate a parent or a family, I think, by coming to them and offering a resource, because like the story with my sister illustrates, you don't know whether that parent you don't know what the reason is for that resource not being present, or for the perception that that child is lacking that resource. There are so many things that you can presume in that situation that feel right that aren't, and there are so many things that are at play that you might not know. So my advice is not to approach a specific parent or a specific family with a resource. Again, though, if you suspect there's a resource that's needed, my advice is to make that resource available, or to make the information on gaining that resource available to all the families that you work with, making sure that the family that you're worried about has that information, but that everyone else has it too. It's not a specific thing. It's really easy for a parent, particularly a parent who's struggling to provide a resource. I think it's very difficult for a parent to face and to hear an educator saying, I can provide something for your child that you can't. And I think quickly that will shut a parent down. A lot of people that will shut down. I know it would me. I wouldn't be able to deal with that teacher. So I think that's a way to lose your connection with that parent if you single them out. And I'm not, it sounds to me in my head sometimes like I'm saying, don't provide kids with resources, and that's certainly not what I'm saying. If you have the ability to connect a child with a resource that they need, by all means, do it. Just don't make it a specific, don't address it to a specific child. Make that resource or that information available to everybody that you work with. Yes?
If you're having, I don't want to say trouble, that's not the right word, but
Okay.
if you're having, if you notice that something is different,
Uh-huh.
and you have to have that teacher-parent conference,
Yeah.
how can you say it in a nice way? What can I do to make this easy, to make this school experience, easier for your child? How would you say that in a way that's not insulting or not to where it would immediately put up walls?
Right. That's a good question, and I think it can be a dangerous thing sometimes to assume that we know what it is that we need to provide a family with. I think we should go into every conversation with parents assuming that there are things we don't know, and that's okay, that they have their family dynamic and we don't always need to know. So to address anything that the child is lacking in the class very specifically as, this is what is required for this class, your child is lacking it, and to everyone in the class, here's how you can access that. So you need, elementary school level, you need school supplies, your kid needs crayons, and here's a kid who doesn't have crayons, and maybe that kid keeps giving their crayons away on the bus or losing them, or Big Brother's hiding them, or maybe the kid can't buy crayons. And that's a very boiled down example. Clearly the problems you're going to face are bigger than crayons, but specifically address, okay, we've got a, stack of crayons over here if anybody needs them, to every parent. I think having a conversation with a specific parent about what they might not be providing to help a child fit in is not necessarily going to be a successful conversation, because we don't know the factors involved, and because it's not possible to judge those factors accurately from our perspective. Does that answer your question at all? You don't look like it does.
Well, I'm talking about, you said, the learning curve.
Yeah.
This raising your
Right.
Like, not, like, I don't know how to say it, I guess.
Like, not necessarily resources, but like skills that the kid is lacking.
Right, like, to help them have an easier school experience.
Yeah.
How can you address that? Like, how can you help them navigate their way through school?
Yeah. Well, there are a couple of ways to do that. And one way is to make sure that you're modeling those behaviors and pointing them out when they're being modeled by other students. So with younger kids, you know, modeling things that you assume kids know, even when they get to you and they're a little bit older, how to gain a teacher's attention, how to ask for something if they need it, that it's okay to interrupt class to ask for something if you need it. And so modeling, and then also building your environment, your classroom environment. And this is harder when you're student teaching, and I know that that's not your environment, but when you're in your own classroom and you have the flexibility to build that environment, to build it in such a way that there are a lot of different ways to meet a goal, that there's not just one box you can check to get where you need to go, that there are different ways to signify that you need the teacher's attention. There are different ways to signify that you don't have resources that you need. There are different ways to approach the skill. There are different skills that you can use to achieve the same goal in that classroom. And I know that's a lot to think about, particularly when your desk is piled high with paperwork and the phone's ringing and there's a lot going on. But keeping that in mind as you build your expectations for your kids can be really beneficial. To model what they do have to be able to do and to try to make available alternate paths to reaching that same goal. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah.
Now there's often universal breakfast and lunch at schools.
Yeah.
But that's relatively new. Did you and your sisters participate in a school lunch program? And if so, how did that go?
We did. That's a great question. We did receive free or reduced lunch a lot of the times. And I remember specifically when I found out what that was. And luckily, I was very naive as a kid, and I didn't have any type of negative connotation, and I'm so glad that I didn't have any type of negative connotation associated with receiving something for free. I thought, cool, I'm clever, I got something for free. So for me, I was like, this is great. I like school lunch, I like mashed potatoes, and I get it for free. I think that was at times a little bit harder when I got older, and I think it was a little bit harder for my sisters who were older at the peak of our poverty. But it was not, at the time, I was lucky that it wasn't, that the people who received free or reduced lunch were not singled out in any way. You know, the way that we used to gain lunch was the same, it looked the same. You know, so it wasn't like we had a different colored ticket or something. I know that's happened in the past, but it wasn't, where and when I went to school, it wasn't like that. So for me, I didn't feel singled out. I felt very comfortable. But I do think that universal breakfast and lunch is a wonderful thing because it doesn't single anybody out. And kids who are a little older and who do feel a little more alienated at times, I think that would be very helpful for them to have access to free food with no strings attached. Yeah.
When I was growing up, I had free lunch, but it was a little different. Like you said, your lunch number, and some people,
Yeah.
I know in high school we had to pay, but by the time I got to high school, I didn't have free lunch.
Yeah.
But when my sister was in high school, she did, and no one, I mean, the kids we didn't get made fun of for it. Like,
Good.
It wasn't a big deal, and everybody was just like, "Oh, you don't have to spend your money on lunch."
Right.
It wasn't anything that was like in middle school. I had it, but I would have like a couple $dollars every day.
Yeah.
But I didn't have to spend it on lunch. Like I could get something out of the snack machine or something.
Right.
You know? So it was, but now they bill you at school.
Right.
You just say your number or swipe your card and you can't tell, but
Yeah.
it never had a negative connotation when I was in school with the other kids. Like,
Good.
I never got made fun of for having free lunch, and we were super poor, but
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well-
I guess I felt poor.
Right.
It affected my sister more, but that never affected her really. So I don't think kids really care as much. Maybe middle school and high school, but in elementary school, kids aren't like, oh, you have free lunch. Like they don't, you don't really get made fun of for it.
Good. Yeah, that was my experience too. In elementary school, kids were like, "Neat, you get something for free." And how can I get something for free? So yeah, I think that's accurate. Other questions? Yeah.
This is one of your story about Walmart.
Was it the same kid that said, hey, I seen you at Walmart that was with the parent?
Yes. Yes, it was.
What did you say?
I did not say a word. I walked away. I panicked. Deer in the headlights panic. I smiled and I walked away. I didn't know what to do, and I never addressed it again when I would see that child. I never addressed it again, and she didn't bring it up. I was alarmed that she, had very quickly generalized the lesson of fearing difference, but I did not address it, and I just panicked. I was lucky to finish out that day. I was having such a horrible time that day. Yeah.
Yeah, well, the general theme of what you talk about is never assume anything and make sure you respect the boundaries for the kids.
Right.
That way you don't out them in front of other people.
Right.
My question is, how do you reconcile that with the increased demand for us to be mentors in the classroom? And we were also told at my school that you want to make sure that if you see something, make sure you're aware of these signs so that you want to notify CPS in case, because you don't want that to be on you for neglecting them. How do we reconcile that gray area of being like mentor and not outing other people?
Right. I think just the overriding thing that you have to approach each of those unique situations with is to not assume anything. If you need to notify CPS, if there's a child you feel like doesn't have something that is vital to live, or that they're in an unsafe situation, absolutely notify who you need to notify. But a lot of times we see kids before it gets to that point, get singled out. And everybody knows that's the kid who has this problem going on, and that's what I mean when I say not to call anybody out, not to single anybody out, and of course if it gets to a point where you're going to have to make that call, you're still not going to single that child out or treat that child any differently in front of their peers. As far as being a mentor, I think, as teachers we are, and we have to model behavior, and part of that to me is modeling the idea that we can't make assumptions about each other, and that we need to interact with each other in the moment, and based on how we want to treat each other, rather than what might be going on, outside that classroom in that child's life, if that makes sense.
Well, is there any ways that you would recommend that we can make ourselves available to those kids without, making it available to everybody without singling anybody out? Like, is there like a message box where they can put stuff in, or
that's
make yourself more open to the students, let them know that they can come to you with anything?
Yeah, and that's a great idea, having different ways for a kid who does need to ask you for help, how they can access that help without having to call attention to themselves. And you mentioned a message box. That's a great idea. Having hours where you're in the classroom alone is a great idea, where they can come to you. And that goes along with finding various paths for kids to get things that they need, and to get support that they need. Maybe you can have some after school hours or before school hours where you're available, or during lunch. Maybe you can have a written system for kids to get in touch with you. Maybe kids can have your school email where they can contact you if they are in the school library and they need to send you an email about something privately. Having a lot of different ways for kids to contact you if they do have something that they need to come to you with is a great idea. And you sound like you've already you've been thinking about that and have good options for that. Yeah. Other questions? No more?
Would you mention one more thing?
Sure.
And then, unless there are other questions. You mentioned last night how many times you moved as a child. And I think that, coupled with the porta potty repossession, really crystallizes some of the experience.
Yeah. Well, I moved, before I turned 18, I moved 24 times. Now that number is, I think, it's in the early 50s. It's like 54, I think. And most of those, although it took me a long time into adulthood to clarify for myself the reasons for those moves, and I would mumble something, because when somebody hears that number, they ask you, my gosh, why did you move that much? Was your dad in the military? No. It was financial. Each time we moved, it was a different but specific, usually financial or economic reason why we moved. So as an adult, I can understand that. And as a kid, I just knew we moved a whole lot, and I got really good at packing very fast. Any other questions? Well, thank you. You guys came up with some excellent questions. Thanks so much.